Silence, the kind that settles over old train stations at dusk when the last passengers have gone and only the echo of footsteps remains. This is where our story begins, not with answers, but with questions. Not with certainty, but with the faint outline of something deliberately forgotten. The year was 1854. The place, New York City. A metropolis rising from the mud and ambition of a young nation, its streets teeming with immigrants, merchants, dreamers, and the desperate. But among the crowds there walked children, thousands of them, whose origins would become one of the most carefully erased chapters in American history. They called them orphans. The official records say they were the abandoned offspring of immigrants, victims of poverty and disease, collected from the streets and tenements of the eastern seaboard. But the photographs tell a different story. The documents whisper of inconsistencies, and the silence, that peculiar heavy silence that surrounds their true origins, speaks loudest of all. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported from the cities of the East Coast to the farms, towns, and homesteads of the American Midwest and West. They traveled in what history would come to call the orphan trains, a network of rail transport that moved human cargo across a continent, placing children with families who often knew nothing of their true heritage. The Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace in 1853, is credited with organizing this massive relocation. The stated goal was humanitarian, to rescue children from the squalor of urban poverty and give them new lives in the wholesome countryside. But when one examines the records more closely, when one studies the photographs of these children, their clothing, their posture, their bearing, a troubling question emerges. Who were these children, really? And why does the official story work so hard to convince us they were nobody? Consider the photographs that survive from this era. In image after image, we see children dressed in clothing of remarkable quality, intricate lacework, finely tailored coats, boots of genuine leather. These are not the rags of street urchins. These are the garments of privilege, of families who valued education, culture, and refinement. Yet we are told these children were found wandering the alleys, sleeping in doorways, surviving on scraps. In one photograph dated 1867, a group of children stand on a train platform in Ohio. Their faces are solemn, their eyes carry a weight that seems too heavy for their years. A girl of perhaps 8 stands at the front, her hand resting on the shoulder of a younger boy. She wears a dress with geometric embroidery along the collar, a pattern that appears again and again in photographs from this period, a pattern that official history cannot explain. The records of the Children's Aid Society list these children with names that feel incomplete. First names only, or surnames that change from document to document. A boy named Henry in New York becomes Heinrich in Kansas. A girl called Margaret arrives in Nebraska with papers identifying her as Margarethy. These are not the random variations of careless record-keeping. These are the traces of a systematic effort to obscure identity, to sever these children from whatever past they once possessed. The orphan train movement continued for 75 years, spanning 4 generations, touching every state west of the Mississippi. By the time the last train departed in 1929, 250,000 children had been redistributed across America. Today, an estimated 2 million Americans are descended from orphan train riders. 2 million people whose family histories begin with a blank space, a question mark, a silence where memory should be. But the story does not begin on those trains. The story begins in the cities from which these children were taken, cities that, in the mid-19th century, were undergoing a transformation that history books do not fully explain. New York in 1854 was not simply growing, it was being rebuilt. The city that existed before seems to have vanished, replaced by something new, something that bore only a passing resemblance to what came before. Contemporary accounts describe buildings of astonishing grandeur appearing almost overnight, infrastructure that seemed impossible for the technology of the time. And yet, the population of the city was supposedly devastated by waves of immigration, disease, and social upheaval. Where did all the original inhabitants go? What happened to the families who lived in those grand buildings before they became tenements? What happened to their children? The official history tells us that the wealthy moved uptown, that the poor flooded in from abroad, that the city's transformation was simply the natural evolution of an urban center finding its identity. But the orphan trains tell a different story. They tell us that something ended, that a generation vanished, and that the children who remained were scattered to the winds like seeds of a forgotten harvest. In the archives of the New York Historical Society, there exists a letter dated March 15, 1856. It was written by a man named Edmund Hartley, a clerk in the office of the Children's Aid Society. The letter was never sent. It was found among his personal effects after his death in 1891, tucked inside a Bible, hidden as if he feared its discovery. The letter reads, in part, "The children arrive by the dozens each week, and yet we are given no accounting of their origins. Mr. Brace insists they are foundlings, abandoned by parents who could not care for them. But I have seen their clothing, sir. I have heard them speak. These are not the children of immigrants. These are not the offspring of the poor. Something terrible has happened to their families, and we are made complicit in the forgetting." Edmund Hartley never explained what he meant. He never identified who he intended to send this letter to. He worked for the Children's Aid Society for another 35 years, processing thousands of children, placing them on trains that would carry them away from everything they had known. And when he died alone in a boarding house on the Lower East Side, the only possession of value found among his things was that unsent letter, and a collection of photographs showing children whose names he had never been allowed to record. The trains departed from Grand Central Depot, from the Erie Railroad Terminal, from stations whose very architecture seemed designed for something grander than the humble work of charity. These were cathedrals of iron and glass, monuments to an industrial ambition that history tells us was only just beginning. And yet the photographs show these terminals already standing in their full glory, already complete, already filled with the machinery of transport that would carry a generation into oblivion. Who built these stations? When were they constructed? The official records say they were built by immigrant labor, financed by the railroad barons of the Gilded Age. But the timeline does not align. Buildings that should have taken decades to construct appear in photographs mere years after the land was supposedly cleared. Technologies that should have been impossible are visible in their design. Heating systems, electrical conduits, acoustic arrangements that modern engineers struggle to replicate. And it was through these stations that the children passed, like ghosts walking through a world that was no longer theirs. They were given new names, new identities, new families. They were told to forget where they came from. They were told that their past was a burden, that their memories were unreliable, that the life they remembered before the train was nothing more than the fever dream of a sick child. But children remember. Even when they are told to forget, something remains, a fragment, a sensation, a word spoken in a language their new families did not understand. And when these orphan train riders grew old, when they had children and grandchildren of their own, some of them began to speak of what they remembered. They remembered grand houses with high ceilings and ornate moldings. They remembered gardens that seemed to stretch forever, filled with plants and flowers they would never see again. They remembered parents who read to them in languages that had no name, who taught them songs that seemed to resonate with something deep in the earth itself. They remembered a world of beauty and order, a world that ended suddenly, violently, without explanation. And then they remembered the trains, the crowded cars, the crying children, the adults in dark coats who spoke in whispers and never smiled. They remembered arriving in strange towns where people lined up to inspect them like livestock at auction. They remembered being chosen or not chosen based on the strength of their hands, the straightness of their teeth, the emptiness in their eyes. What happened to the children who were not chosen? The records do not say. They simply disappear from the documents, their names crossed out, their fates unknown. Some were returned to the cities, presumably to live out their lives in institutions. Others seem to have vanished entirely, their existence acknowledged only by a line in a ledger and a photograph that shows a child's face, frozen in time, waiting for a family that would never come. The orphan train movement is presented in history books as a benevolent innovation, the first organized child welfare program in American history. Charles Loring Brace is celebrated as a visionary reformer, a man who saw the suffering of children and devoted his life to alleviating it. And perhaps in some small measure this is true. Perhaps some children did find loving homes, did escape genuine poverty, did build lives that their birth families could never have provided. But the scale of the operation, the secrecy surrounding its origins, the systematic erasure of the children's identities, these elements suggest something more than simple charity. They suggest a coordinated effort to redistribute a population, to scatter the remnants of a community that no longer existed, to ensure that whatever those children might remember would die with them. Fragmented and unconfirmed, dismissed as the fantasies of troubled minds. The last orphan train departed from New York City on May 31st, 1929. By that time, the Children's Aid Society had long since shifted its focus to other forms of child welfare, and the era of mass child transport was coming to an end. But the effects of those 75 years would ripple through American history for generations to come. 2 million descendants. 2 million Americans who carry in their blood the memory of a journey they can never fully trace. 2 million people whose family trees have a root system that disappears into darkness, into silence, into the carefully maintained forgetting of official history. And somewhere in the archives that no one is allowed to access, in the records that were sealed and never reopened, in the photographs that were collected and never cataloged, somewhere the truth waits. It's the names of the parents, the addresses of the homes, the story of what happened to the generation that vanished. This is not a story of orphans. This is a story of children who were made to be orphans, whose families were erased so thoroughly that even their descendants do not know to mourn them. This is a story of a world that ended, and of the train that carried its children away. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of forgotten history move something deep within you, if you believe that the truth deserves to be remembered, then join this community of seekers. Subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals something even more disturbing about where these children truly came from. Before we can understand where the children went, we must first understand where they came from. And this requires us to look at the cities of mid-19th century America with new eyes, to see not what we are told was there, but what the evidence suggests actually existed. The official history of American urbanization follows a familiar narrative. The great cities of the eastern seaboard, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, grew gradually through waves of immigration, industrialization, and westward expansion. The buildings we see in photographs from the 1850s and 1860s are presented as the products of this growth, constructed by the labor of newly arrived immigrants using techniques imported from Europe. But this narrative contains contradictions that become increasingly difficult to ignore. Consider the case of Philadelphia in 1854, the same year the orphan train movement began. In that year, the city completed its consolidation, absorbing surrounding districts to become one of the largest municipalities in the United States. The official population was approximately 500,000, a number that had supposedly grown from fewer than 100,000 just 50 years earlier. Yet, the infrastructure of the city, its streets, its water systems, its public buildings, suggests a population capacity far greater than what the records indicate. The Fairmount Waterworks, completed in 1822, was one of the most sophisticated hydraulic systems in the world, capable of supplying water to a city of over 1 million residents. The grid of streets laid out in William Penn's original plan extended far beyond the developed areas of the city, as if anticipating growth that would never quite materialize. And most strikingly, the grand public buildings of Philadelphia, Independence Hall, the Second Bank of the United States, the Merchants Exchange, exhibit architectural and acoustic properties that seem designed for purposes beyond their stated functions. The proportions of these buildings follow geometric ratios that appear again and again in Tartarian architecture around the world. The materials used in their construction, imported marble, precisely cut stone, metalwork of extraordinary refinement, suggest a level of technological sophistication that contradicts the official timeline of American development. Who built these structures? When were they truly constructed? And what happened to the civilization that created them? The answers to these questions may lie in an event that history books mention only in passing: the Great Fire of 1839. On June 22, 1839, a fire broke out in the commercial district of Philadelphia. By the time it was extinguished, 52 buildings had been destroyed, and damage was estimated at over $2 million, an astronomical sum for the time. The fire was attributed to an overturned lamp in a warehouse, and the response to it is presented as a triumph of early firefighting. But contemporary accounts describe something that does not fit this simple narrative. Witnesses reported that the fire seemed to spread in patterns that defied natural explanation, jumping from building to building as if guided by an invisible hand. The structures that burned were among the oldest in the city, buildings whose construction predated the official founding of Philadelphia itself. And in the aftermath of the fire, something remarkable happened. The destroyed buildings were not rebuilt to their original specifications. Instead, they were replaced with simpler structures, less ornate, less sophisticated, as if the knowledge required to replicate them had been lost. Similar fires occurred in cities across America during this period. Boston in 1872, Chicago in 1871, San Francisco would later follow in 1906 each time. The fires destroyed the oldest and most architecturally significant buildings in the city. Each time, the reconstruction that followed resulted in structures that were somehow lesser, smaller, simpler, more aligned with the industrial aesthetic that would come to define American cities. Were these fires accidents? Or were they part of a systematic erasure of the physical evidence of a civilization that preceded our own? The children who rode the orphan trains came from these cities. They came from the neighborhoods that burned, from the communities that were scattered, from the families whose grand houses were reduced to tenements or rubble. And when they were placed on those trains and sent west, they carried with them the last living memory of a world that was being deliberately destroyed. In New York City, the transformation was even more dramatic. The city that exists today bears almost no resemblance to the city that existed in the early 19th century. The famous grid of streets laid out in the Commissioner's Plan of 1811 was imposed upon a landscape that already contained structures, roads, and communities. The plan required the demolition of existing buildings, the leveling of hills, the filling of waterways. It was, in effect, a complete reconstruction of the urban environment. But what was there before? The official history speaks of farms, of country estates, of small villages that were gradually absorbed into the expanding city. But the photographs that survive from the transition period show something else entirely. And they show grand buildings of stone and brick, churches with spires that rivaled European cathedrals, public spaces of remarkable beauty and sophistication. They show a city that was already complete, already thriving, already home to a population whose existence would later be erased from the records. The Central Park we know today was created in the 1850s and 1860s, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. The official story tells us that the park was carved from rough terrain, rocky outcrops, swamps, scattered settlements of impoverished residents who were relocated to make way for the project. But the landscape we see in early photographs of the park's construction tells a different story. In these images, workers are not creating new features so much as uncovering old ones. Bridges appear that seem to predate the park's official design. Paths follow routes that were already established. Architectural elements emerge from the earth as if they had been buried, waiting to be revealed. And the residents who were displaced, the communities of Seneca Village, of the Piggery District, of the unnamed settlements along the northern reaches, these people disappear from history as completely as if they had never existed. Who were they? What happened to them? And were there children among those who would later ride the orphan trains to new lives in the West? The questions multiply the deeper one looks. In Baltimore, the Great Fire of 1904 destroyed over 1,500 buildings in the heart of the city. The fire burned for more than 30 hours, and the heat was so intense that it melted the iron columns of the supposedly fireproof buildings. Yet certain structures survived, the newer buildings constructed with modern techniques. The older buildings, those whose architecture defied explanation, were consumed entirely. In Boston, the fire of 1872 destroyed 776 buildings across 65 acres of the city's commercial district. Among the structures lost were some of the finest examples of early American architecture, buildings whose construction techniques remain mysterious to this day. The fire began on a Saturday evening and burned through Sunday as if deliberately timed to maximize destruction while minimizing the response. And in each of these cities, in the years following the fires, the orphan trains ran with increased frequency. Children appeared in the records of the Children's Aid Society whose origins were listed simply as fire victims, displaced, unknown. These children were processed quickly, placed on trains within days of their arrival, sent to destinations far from the cities where they had been born. What were these children being hidden from? Or perhaps the question is, what was being hidden from them? The evidence suggests that the great fires of the 19th century were not random accidents but coordinated events designed to erase the physical evidence of a preceding civilization. The children who survived were the most damning evidence of all, living witnesses to a world that was being systematically destroyed, by scattering them across the continent, by severing their connections to their families and communities, by giving them new names and new identities. The orphan train movement ensured that their testimony would never be collected, never be verified, never threaten the official narrative being constructed in the ashes of the old world. The cities that rose from those ashes were different. They were built on a grid, their streets numbered and lettered, their buildings standardized and reproducible. They were cities designed for a new population, a population that would have no memory of what came before. They were cities of forgetting, constructed atop the ruins of cities that remembered too much. And the children, those witnesses to the world that was, became the raw material for a new America. Scattered across farms and factories raised by families who knew nothing of their origins, they grew into adults who could only half remember a childhood that seemed like a dream. They had children of their own, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And with each generation the memory grew fainter, the questions fewer, the silence deeper. But memory is persistent. It finds ways to survive encoded in habits and preferences, in songs hummed without conscious thought, in the inexplicable feeling that something important has been lost. The descendants of the orphan train riders carry this memory in their blood, even when they do not know its name. And when they begin to ask questions about their origins, when they begin to search for the families that history erased, they find themselves facing a wall of silence that extends back more than a century and a half. The cities that disappeared did not simply burn. They were replaced, overwritten. Their very existence denied by a historical record that was carefully constructed to support a predetermined conclusion. And the children who came from those cities, the last generation to remember them, were not rescued. They were silenced. Not all the children went west. Some remained in the cities, absorbed into an expanding network of institutions that would shape their lives and their identities in ways that history books do not fully acknowledge. The mid-19th century saw an explosion in the creation of orphanages, asylums, reformatories, and industrial schools across the eastern United States. The official explanation for this expansion is simple. Urbanization and immigration created social problems that required institutional solutions. Children who could not be cared for by their families were placed in these institutions, where they received food, shelter, education, and moral instruction. But the scale of institutionalization during this period defies this simple explanation. By 1880, there were over 600 orphanages in the United States, housing hundreds of thousands of children. The largest of these institutions were not small charitable operations, but massive complexes, sprawling across acres of land, their buildings rivaling the grandest structures in the country. The Girard College in Philadelphia, founded in 1848, occupied a campus of 43 acres and featured a main building that remains one of the most impressive examples of Greek Revival architecture in America. The building's marble columns, imported from Greece itself, support a structure whose proportions follow the same geometric principles found in the great temples of antiquity. The cost of construction was over $2 million, a fortune that exceeded the budget of many state governments. Who was this institution built for? According to the official history, Girard College was established through the bequest of Stephen Girard, a wealthy banker and philanthropist, to educate poor, white orphaned boys. The wills specified in remarkable detail the requirements for admission. The children must be between 6 and 10 years of age. They must be orphans, they must be white, and they must be born of parents who were never more than moderately wealthy. These specifications have troubled historians for generations. Why such precise requirements? Why the exclusion of children whose parents had been wealthy? The usual explanation is that Girard wished to help those most in need. But another interpretation suggests itself. The requirements were designed to identify a specific population, children whose families had been destroyed by the events of the preceding decades, children who might otherwise remember a life of privilege and wonder why it had ended. The children of Girard College were raised in complete isolation from the outside world. They were forbidden contact with family members, even those who might have survived. They were given a rigorous education that emphasized loyalty to the new nation and suspicion of foreign influences. They were taught trades that would make them useful workers in the industrial economy that was being constructed around them. And when they graduated at age 18, they were sent out into a world that had no record of who they had been, no memory of where they had come from, no acknowledgement that they had ever existed before they walked through the gates of that marble temple on Girard Avenue. Similar institutions operated in every major city. The New York House of Refuge, established in 1824, became the model for juvenile reformatories across the nation. Its official purpose was to rehabilitate young offenders, to transform juvenile delinquents into productive citizens. But the children who passed through its doors were often guilty of nothing more than being orphaned, being homeless, being inconvenient to a society that was rapidly restructuring itself. The records of the House of Refuge reveal a systematic process of identity erasure. Upon admission, children were assigned numbers that replaced their names. Their personal possessions were confiscated and destroyed. Their hair was cut, their clothing replaced with institutional uniforms. They were forbidden to speak of their past, forbidden to ask questions about their families, forbidden to correspond with anyone outside the walls. The daily schedule was designed to break down individual identity and replace it with institutional loyalty. Children woke at 5 in the morning, worked 12-hour shifts in the institution's workshops, received 2 hours of schooling focused on obedience and utility, and were confined to dormitories that held up to 100 beds. Punishment for infractions was severe: solitary confinement, reduced rations, physical discipline, and yet the buildings themselves were magnificent. The architecture of the House of Refuge, like that of Girard College, suggested a purpose far grander than the humble work of reform. The central administration building featured a dome that echoed the designs of European capitals. The workshops were arranged around courtyards that followed principles of sacred geometry. The very layout of the institution seemed designed to channel energy, to focus attention, to create an environment of psychological transformation. Who designed these buildings? Who understood the principles of architecture and acoustics that they embodied? The official record credits local builders, immigrant laborers, the practical ingenuity of American enterprise. But the sophistication of the design suggests knowledge that was not widely available, techniques that were not commonly taught, an understanding of the relationship between architecture and consciousness that the industrial age would soon forget. The children who grew up in these institutions emerged as something new. They were not the children who had entered with their memories of grand houses and cultivated parents, their fragments of songs in unknown languages. They were workers, citizens, Americans, their identities forged in the furnace of institutional discipline, their memories replaced with the approved narratives of the new nation. But some of them remembered. In the quiet hours of the night, in the moments between sleep and waking, fragments would surface: a face, a voice, a feeling of loss so profound that it had no name. These memories were dangerous. They were evidence of a life that was not supposed to have existed. And so the children learned to bury them, to deny them even to themselves, to become the blank slates that the institutions required. The institutional system and the orphan trains worked in concert. Children who proved difficult to place in the West were sent to institutions. Children who proved difficult to manage in institutions were placed on trains. The two systems formed a comprehensive network for processing the remnants of a vanished population, ensuring that no child remained who might one day speak of what they remembered. By the 1880s, the system had achieved its purpose. The generation that had known the old world was passing into age and death. Their children, scattered and institutionalized, had been successfully severed from their heritage. Their grandchildren would grow up knowing nothing of what had been lost, asking no questions about the blank spaces in their family trees. The institutions themselves began to change. The grand buildings, with their mysterious architecture and their echoes of a forgotten knowledge, were gradually demolished or repurposed. New facilities were constructed, functional, efficient, stripped of any ornament that might suggest a deeper purpose. The era of transformation was over. The era of forgetting had begun. And here I must pause, because if you have followed this story to this point, if you have felt the weight of what has been lost, if something within you resonates with the silence of those forgotten children, then you understand why this channel exists. You understand why these stories must be told. So leave a comment now with the words "I remember," just those 2 words. Because somewhere in a place beyond memory, the children who rode those trains, who walked through those institutional gates, who lost everything and were told to forget, somewhere they are waiting to be remembered. Your comment is a candle in that darkness. I remember. The trains carried the children westward, across a landscape that was itself being transformed. The America they traveled through was not the wilderness of popular imagination. It was a land dotted with structures whose origins no one could explain, crossed by roads that predated any known settlement, marked by foundations of buildings that had never been completed or had been demolished before memory. The children were distributed to towns across the Midwest and Great Plains to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond. They arrived at train stations where local families would gather to inspect them, to choose which children they would take home. The process was called placing out, a term that carried connotations of arrangement, of deliberate positioning, as if the children were pieces in a game whose rules had been determined long before. The families who received these children were told they were doing charitable work, providing homes for the unfortunate offspring of urban poverty. Many believed this story and treated the children with genuine kindness, but others saw the children as labor, strong backs and small hands to work the farms, to tend the livestock, to perform the endless tasks that frontier life demanded. The children adapted, as children do. They learned the rhythms of agricultural life, the names of crops and animals. the patterns of seasons they had never known in the cities of the East. They grew into the identities they were given, becoming farmers, merchants, teachers, parents. The memories of their early childhood faded, replaced by the immediate demands of survival and the gradual accumulation of new experiences. But the past was not entirely erased. In the towns where the orphan train riders settled, patterns emerged that would persist for generations. These communities showed unusual rates of innovation, of artistic expression, of mechanical aptitude. The children who were supposed to be the abandoned offspring of immigrants displayed talents and inclinations that suggested a different heritage entirely. In Kansas, a group of orphan train riders who had been placed in neighboring farms formed a musical society in 1878. They performed compositions that none of them could explain, having learned intricate harmonies, unusual scales, songs and languages they could not name. The society existed for only 3 years before its members dispersed, but the music they created was transcribed by a local minister and survived in his personal papers. When these transcriptions were analyzed by musicologists in the 20th century, they were found to contain melodic structures that did not match any known European or American tradition. In Nebraska, a woman named Clara Hoffman, who had arrived on an orphan train in 1869 at the age of 7, became known for her extraordinary gardens. The plants she cultivated included varieties that agricultural experts could not identify, flowers of unusual colors, herbs with medicinal properties that were not documented in any pharmacopoeia. When asked where she had learned her horticultural knowledge, Claire would say only that she remembered it from before, a word she used to describe a time and place that she could never fully articulate. These were not isolated cases. Across the regions where orphan train riders settled, similar patterns appeared. Knowledge that should not have existed, skills that could not be explained by environment or education, a persistent sense of otherness that set these individuals apart from their neighbors, even as they worked to assimilate into their adopted communities. The children grew old. They had children of their own and grandchildren. The direct memory of the trains faded, but something remained, encoded in family traditions, in unexplained talents, in the persistent feeling that something important had been lost. The descendants of the orphan train riders became a hidden thread running through American society, their true heritage unknown even to themselves. Every system of forgetting requires its keepers, those who maintain the silence, who guard the archives, who ensure that the questions are never asked and the answers are never found. The Children's Aid Society continued its operations well into the 20th century, its records accumulating in warehouses and basements, its files growing ever larger as generation after generation passed through its care. But access to these records was carefully controlled. Researchers who sought to trace the origins of specific children found themselves confronted with bureaucratic obstacles, missing files, and polite but firm refusals. The Orphan Train Heritage Society of America was founded in 1986, ostensibly to preserve the history of the movement and to help descendants trace their ancestry. But the Society's work has always operated within careful boundaries. It celebrates the humanitarian aspects of the orphan trains while avoiding questions about the true origins of the children. It connects descendants with each other while discouraging investigation into the systematic nature of the identity erasure that made those connections necessary. The archives that do exist tell a story of incompleteness. Names that change from document to document, birth dates that shift by years, origins listed simply as New York or unknown when more specific information should have been available. The paper trail that should lead back to families and communities instead leads to dead ends, to sealed records, to the impenetrable silence of official history. Some descendants have persisted in their investigations despite these obstacles. They have traced their families back to the trains, back to the institutions, back to the cities from which their ancestors were taken. And what they have found has confirmed what the evidence suggests. These were not random orphans collected from the streets. These were the children of a specific population, a community that was deliberately destroyed, its members scattered, and its memory erased. The keepers of silence are not villains in the conventional sense. Many of them believe they are protecting the descendants from painful truths, preserving social stability, maintaining a narrative that serves the greater good. But their work has consequences. Every question that goes unanswered, every record that remains sealed, every descendant who is told that their family history begins with a train ride and nothing more. These are wounds that do not heal because they are not acknowledged. The silence is breaking now. In archives across the country, researchers are finding documents that were overlooked or deliberately hidden. In families across America, descendants are comparing notes, sharing discoveries, building a picture of what was lost. The truth is emerging slowly, painfully, one fragment at a time. We return at last to the children themselves. Not as they were scattered and silent, their memories suppressed, fussed, their identities erased, but as they exist now, in the descendants who carry their blood and their unspoken stories. 2 million Americans trace their ancestry to the orphan trains. 2 million people whose family trees contain a void, a silence, a generation that was taken and never returned. For most of them, this heritage is unknown or unacknowledged. A blank space in the record that seems unremarkable until one begins to ask questions. But for those who have investigated, who have searched the archives and interviewed the elders and pieced together the fragments of a forgotten past, a different picture emerges. They discover that they are not descended from random orphans, but from a specific population, a people whose culture, whose knowledge, whose very existence was systematically erased in the decades following 1854. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. The architectural sophistication of the buildings their ancestors inhabited, the technological knowledge that their family lines have preserved across generations, the persistent feeling reported by descendant after descendant that something important was lost, that there is a heritage waiting to be reclaimed, that the silence of official history is not an absence but a presence, the presence of a truth that refuses to be forgotten. What was the world that these children came from? The evidence suggests a civilization of remarkable achievement, a society that understood principles of architecture, acoustics, and energy that our current technology is only beginning to rediscover. The grand buildings of the American cities, the infrastructure that seemed to appear overnight, the knowledge that was preserved in fragments by the scattered children, these are the traces of a world that was not primitive but advanced, not chaotic but ordered, not forgotten but deliberately erased. The fires that destroyed the oldest buildings, the institutions that processed the surviving children, the trains that scattered them across a continent, the records that were sealed or destroyed. These were not random events but coordinated actions, a systematic effort to eliminate a civilization and replace it with something new. The children were the most dangerous evidence of all, living witnesses to a world that was not supposed to have existed. By dispersing them, by severing their connections, by teaching them to forget, the architects of the new order ensured that their testimony would never threaten the narrative being constructed in the ashes of the old world. But they did not account for the persistence of memory. They did not anticipate that the children would pass something to their descendants, not conscious knowledge, but something deeper. A resonance, a recognition, a feeling that surfaces when one stands in an old building and senses that the walls remember something the mind cannot access. The children remember. They remember through their descendants, through the questions that refuse to be silenced, through the search for truth that draws millions of Americans to investigate their ancestry. They remember through the channels and communities that are forming now, connecting the scattered fragments, rebuilding the picture of what was lost. This story does not have an ending. The truth is still emerging, one discovery at a time. The archives are still being searched, the records still being decoded, the descendants still finding each other across the distances that were meant to keep them apart. What was scattered is being gathered. What was silenced is beginning to speak. The trains have stopped running. The institutions have closed or been transformed. The keepers of silence are passing into history themselves, and in the space they leave behind, something is growing, a movement of remembrance, of investigation, of refusal to accept the official story when the evidence points elsewhere. The children of Tartaria were taken and forgotten. But forgetting is not permanent. Memory finds a way. And those 2 million descendants, those inheritors of an erased heritage, are beginning to remember who they truly are. The trains carried them away from everything they knew. The institutions taught them to forget. The records were sealed, the archives hidden, the questions discouraged. For 170 years, the silence held. But silence is not the same as absence. In the blood of the descendants, in the fragments that surface in dreams, in the inexplicable knowledge that passes from generation to generation without explanation, in all of these the children remain, waiting, remembering, ready to be found. The world that was erased has not disappeared. It survives in the structures that still stand, in the knowledge that refuses to be lost, in the descendants who carry its memory without knowing its name. And perhaps, the time is coming when the silence will finally break, when the archives will open, when the truth will emerge from the shadows where it has been hiding for so long. Until then, we remember. We search. We refuse to accept the narrative that tells us our ancestors were nobodies, that our heritage is a blank space, that the questions we ask have no answers. We are the children of the trains, the descendants of the forgotten, the inheritors of a world that was taken from us before we were born. And we are beginning to remember. If you watch this far, it's because this story touched something within you, something that recognizes the truth hidden beneath the silence of official history. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who you are, who really values the stories we share on this channel. If this video moved you, if it made you question what you thought you knew, then hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the next story we uncover may be even more revealing than this one. The children of Tartaria are waiting to be remembered. Thank you for being part of that remembrance.